Hello, bonjour. I'm Adnan Husain, Director of the Muslim Society's Global Perspectives Project, and welcome to the Majlis podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by a co-host today who's known to you if you've listened to our back catalog. She's hosted many previous episodes of the Majlis. Amel Bensalim, an MA student in history here at Queen's University. Welcome, Amel.
Hello, thank you. It's so great to be hosting again.
Yeah, it's great that we can have this dialogue together. Unfortunately, the occasion for it, of course, is a terrible tragedy that happened on June 6th in London, Ontario, on the streets of London, Ontario. I think by now everyone has heard that the Afzaal family, 3 generations of whom were killed in a brutal attack using a black pickup truck as a weapon. They were mown down. Only a young boy of 8, 9 years old survived the attack. And since that time, there has been an outpouring of grief, vigils across Canada, among Muslim communities and beyond, and the topic of Islamophobia has come to the fore, and I should say a contested topic, and that's what we'll be discussing today. There is some news in the case. Yesterday, Nathaniel Veltman, the alleged perpetrator who had been taken into custody very soon after the attack, was charged with terrorism, and so we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit more about those charges and the pertaining laws and what that has to say about the case and about the wider question of Islamophobia in Canada. And hopefully we can also talk about the transnational or global context in which this form of racial and religious bigotry is operating in societies around the world. And to do so with us, we have 2 guests, Azeezah Kanji, who has been a panelist and participant and a co-host on the Majlis in the past. She is a legal academic based in Toronto and a writer. Azeezah, welcome back to the Majlis.
Hi, Adnan.
And then also joining us is Dr. Yasmine Djerbal. She recently completed and defended her PhD in cultural studies here at Queen's University on a topic related very much to the subject of today's discussion, which is Muslims in Canada and France and the various ways in which they are made not to belong and their citizenship is undermined in their status. So dealing with Islamophobia. So we're delighted that you could join us to shed some light on these topics and structures. Yasmine, welcome to the Majlis.
Thank you, and thank you for having me, and Amel.
Well, as I mentioned, there are a number of vigils that have taken place. There's been a lot of public discussion, news coverage about these events. Of course, we're a week or more. We're about 9-10 days on from the actual event, and so I'm wondering, each of you, what was your initial reactions and thoughts about the situation, and subsequently, now that some time has passed and perhaps some of the media spotlight has been taken off, how would you assess the reactions among politicians in the Muslim community? What are your reflections on what this week has been like for Muslims in Canada? Azeezah, would you like to go ahead and start?
Thanks, Adnan. We've certainly, in the wake of this attack, seen much more sustained attention and coverage of it than we have in the wake of previous attacks, such as the Quebec Mosque Massacre in 2017. The evening that Quebec Mosque Massacre happened, I remember sitting in front of the television, anxiously awaiting news of what had happened. And the CBC, the National, devoted a grand total of 6 minutes of coverage that night to the massacre, the night that it happened. In contrast, when an attack perpetrated by Muslims a few months later in London, England, happened, they devoted 5 or 6 hours of live coverage to it. So we saw these very extreme disparities, even just at the most basic quantitative level, in terms of the attention and coverage that violence by Muslims versus violence against Muslims was deemed to merit. In the wake of this attack, we have seen, in contrast, sustained wall-to-wall coverage, which I think makes the disparities in the treatment of these different types of violence more difficult to discern, because it's no longer so apparent from statistics such as 6 minutes versus 6 hours of coverage. Instead, we have to look more deeply, qualitatively, at the way that these types of violence are being interpreted and analyzed. And what we've seen with the coverage, as you said, it's a lot of vigils, it's a lot of expressions of grief, a lot of attention paid to the interpersonal aspect of racism, to putting Muslims in a position where we're constantly forced to reiterate our grief and our trauma time and time again to show that we're human, while the conditions that have necessitated Muslims to prove their humanity in the first place remain largely uninterrogated. So we're still largely not talking about the entire breadth of counterterrorism measures that are premised on the devaluation and demonization of Muslim life. We're talking about the interpersonal targeting of Muslim women by private actors like Nathaniel Veltman, but we're not talking about laws like the Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, a law supported by both the liberals and the conservatives that effectively labeled Muslim, South Asian, and Arab communities barbaric. So we're still largely not examining this whole well of state-sponsored Islamophobia and racism from which the actions of a private extremist like Nathan Veltman could arise. And that to me is very troubling, because while it may look like we're addressing Islamophobia because now we're talking about it constantly, we're still really obscuring and avoiding the conversation that needs to happen.
Well, I thank you for that. We will definitely examine that context today, later in our program. I'm looking forward to that. But Yasmine, I'm wondering if you have any reflections about the event and the subsequent week or so.
I think similarly to Azeezah, I've been thinking a lot about the types of violence that have been perpetuated against communities of color in Canada, and Muslim communities in particular. I think that this is very much the tip of the iceberg. These are the, hate crimes and crimes that are committed at their utmost level of violence, right? And so these are the ones that we see in the news. And yet there are also all of these aggressions and violence that we don't hear about and that are yet, very present. I remember looking at the National Council of Canadian Muslims map of hate crimes committed in Canada, and the whole map, is complete with little points of these everyday occurrences of violence that are happening in the everyday. And also, of course, I want to remain careful about these visuals of violence that are perpetuated against communities, because it also makes it seem as though we are safe nowhere in this country. But also, I think that they speak to a reality of the experiences of many racialized folks and Muslim folks in this conversation in particular. But I think it's really also important to connect this type of violence to other types of violence that are happening in the country against Asian Canadians, against Indigenous peoples, against Black and Brown folks, that are perpetuated both by the government, by police departments, and also in the everyday. So I think this is one aspect for me that I have been thinking a lot about, but also, and as you said, we will be discussing this further in our conversation, but thinking about where this violence is coming from and what has enabled it in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a whole broad context that both of you have referred to that we need to discuss. I'm wondering if maybe before we get to that, one thing I noticed about the public reaction was right away, politicians did come out, wanted to express their sympathies, mentioned that this was an act of terrorism, which was really, a little bit different discursively than we have seen, is being able to name it as such right away. And I'm wondering what you think about that, and also the fact that yesterday the perpetrator was charged under terrorism. So it's almost as if it took that extraordinary recognition by mainstream politicians to name it as terrorism. And what are the kind of outcomes and consequences of that? And the reason why I'm asking that is partly because there's been that kind of consensus among the sort of political elite in Canada. But at the same time, there's been a real division between naming it as terrorism and acknowledging Canada and society's racism overall. I note the difference between Jagmeet Singh's, characterization of Canada as a racist society and the amazing amount of backlash he is receiving for having gone beyond just the consensus of saying, yes, this one act was an act of terrorism, to generalizing it. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or reflections on that, Azeezah.
Let's start by talking about these politicians' expressions of sympathy. We saw Aaron O'Toole saying Assalamu alaikum and quoting passages of the Quran to Muslims, as if for years he has not been at the forefront of promulgating this hateful discourse against Muslims, of demonizing, for example, the government settlement with Omar Khadr for the grotesque torture and extraordinary detention that he experienced with Canadian complicity as a child soldier. This compensation was something that was the bare minimum that was required under international law of Canada to provide. And yet we had politicians like Aaron O'Toole promulgating misinformation in order to demonize this most basic act of compensation to someone who experienced extreme violations of human rights. We saw Trudeau giving tears once again, as he did after the Quebec mosque shooting. And as our Indigenous and Black sisters and brothers know, Trudeau is an expert at delivering tears without any action. He was similarly sorrowful in the wake of the Quebec mosque shooting. And in fact, I think he also did refer to that as an act of terror in the wake of it, although there is some speculation that perhaps that's because there were some initial theories that the attack was actually perpetrated by a Muslim. So I don't know why he called it an act of terrorism, but we know, again, there was this discourse of terrorism, there were his tears, but I have to wonder, who are his tears and his sorrow actually for? And who are the tears and sorrow of these politicians actually for? Is it for the victims of these attacks and the communities who are victimized by them? Or is the sorrow for this shattered image of Canadian multiculturalism, which can't withstand the constant evidence that's delivered to it of the systemic racism deeply embedded in Canada? So at the same time as Trudeau and other politicians were crying about the Quebec mosque shooting, the widows of the men who were killed in the attack had to fight for 2 years in order to be even recognized as victims, to receive victims' compensation. Yasmine Djerbal, the man who was paralyzed in the shooting trying to stop the bullets of Alexandre Bissonnette, according to the Globe and Mail, received not a single visit or a call from a politician while he was lying in recovery in a hospital bed. And so when we look at the sorrow and tears of politicians, I really have to wonder who these sorrow and tears are for. Even supposedly very progressive politicians like Elizabeth May. At a town hall before the election last year, when she was recounting her experience at the vigil for the Quebec mosque shooting, she spent more time talking about how cold she was at the vigil and how she had to borrow gloves from her conservative colleague, Rona Ambrose. She spent more time presenting herself as the hero for standing in the cold to mourn these Muslims than talking about the conditions of state violence and all of these state laws and policies that have normalized this kind of expulsion of Muslims from the realm of humanity in the first place. And so when we look at the way that the discourse of terrorism is being deployed by politicians, I think it's really a way of representing the violence of people like Nathaniel Veltman as something that's extreme and as something that's dissociated from the violence of the state, which is precisely what Jagmeet Singh's comments drew our attention to very importantly.
Oh, indeed. And I think, the fact that it is very connected to, in time, coincidental time-wise, only 1 week after, but perhaps not so coincidental, in structural terms with the revelations of the 215 Indigenous children's remains in Kamloops, BC. But I think, Amel, you had a follow-up question for
Yeah,
Yas.
I just wanted to say that that was a really, I think, excellent summation of the nature of all these apologies and tears that we've been seeing. It seems to me like there is an almost unspoken coalition of Islamophobia across all of the party aisles in Canada that are attempting to absolve themselves of, a state connection. And what I found really interesting too was that of all the politician statements to come out, there was one that really stood out to me for various reasons, but it was from the Conservative MP, hopefully I get his name right, Tim Uppal, I'm not sure, but he was a former minister of multiculturalism under the Conservatives, and he came out with a statement apologizing for his backing of the niqab ban back in, I think, 2015. So I thought that was an interesting, different politician's take, not one that I really liked, but it sort of troubled or slightly made a connection between those previous state policies and the Islamophobia that we see within Canada. And I'm wondering if, Yasmine, you want to continue on the lines that this MP has kind of opened up.
Thank you, Amel. Yeah, I mean, to me, the comments that we have received and the public statements that we have received from Trudeau, from Doug Ford and the other politicians, but also even from the London Police Board, condemning the anti-Muslim hate and violence and terror that were perpetuated by Nathaniel Veltman, to me really felt like gaslighting. And why that is that when considering the role that police services and the government have had in kind of racial profiling, in the criminalization of Indigenous, Black, Brown, and Muslim populations, and the insistent criminalization of Muslims as these always already terrorist bodies, like you say, Azeezah, that have been expulsed from the realm of humanity, really plays a role in the creation of this violence, right? So I think it's very important to note that the concept of terrorism and radicalization have supplied a kind of grammar for gendered and racial coding without ever referring to Islam or Muslims. And yet, since 9/11, state-led Islamophobia has constructed and reified and perpetuated a narrative that of innate Muslim terror and criminality, and Muslims as threat, right? So they are a violent terrorist threat to the nation through their terrorism, through their violence. They are a cultural threat through barbaric cultural practices, disrupting gender equality, etc. They are constructed also as an economic threat, right? So coming as refugees and burdening the welfare system, stealing jobs, and being unemployed, perpetually unemployed within the Canadian system. And finally, as also a demographic threat. So thinking about white nationalist ideas of Canada as, a white nation, and therefore, their presence disrupting national identity. So to me, the construction of this Muslim threat has everything to do with what happens and the kind of violence that is perpetuated against our communities. We can think about how anti-terrorism legislation has been used to perpetuate these ideas. Also laïcité and secularism laws that have been created in Quebec in particular, and that are really entangled with anti-terrorism legislation that construct over and over Muslims as threatening others, right? So they are trying to rescue Muslim women from Muslim men, from their practices, and to me, they become this justification for the suspension of rights, for the erosion of rights, and that lead, like you said, Amel, to, you know, citizenship revocation, to the elimination even of those rights to have rights.
Yeah, and I was also thinking a bit about the issue of visibility in this case as well. I think that comes into play when the image of a Muslim is sort of like someone who wears a hijab most often, and the question of, like you said, demographic threat. I think there's a key element here where this attack was probably initiated by his visceral reaction to seeing a hijabi in public. I was wondering if you wanted to talk a little bit more about either one of you, about the issue of gendered Islamophobia in Canada and how Canadians don't necessarily think of it as a Canadian problem.
Earlier, Yasmine talked about how Islamophobia is really the subject of transpartisan political investment in Canada. Yasmine, I think that was you, right? And so part of the difficulty with Islamophobia is that it provides elements that people from across the political spectrum can buy into. And this idea that Islamophobia is about saving Muslim women from dangerous Muslim men is something that is extremely appealing to conservatives and liberals and progressives alike. And the irony is that in the name of saving Muslim women, it perpetuates and produces so much violence against Muslim women, but that is obscured precisely by this ideological basis of Islamophobia. And so we know when we look at hate crime data that the primary burden of hate violence against Muslims in Canada is borne by Muslim women, but also when we look legislatively at laws like Bill 21, which are claiming to save Muslim women from their barbaric and oppressive and backwards hijabs, or laws like the Zero Tolerance Barbaric Cultural Practices Act, which imposes special criminal and immigration measures on Muslim communities, particularly in the name of saving women from forms of gendered violence that are stereotypically associated with Muslims, like forced marriage and polygamy. But as legal clinics who work closely with the women most affected by these laws have pointed out time and time again, these types of measures don't actually make Muslim women safer. In fact, they make them profoundly less safe because it forces them to engage in the criminalization of their family members who we love. And so I think when we look at gendered Islamophobia, we really have to contest this separation and positioning against of Muslim women versus Muslim men, and the representation of them as their rights and their interests as being antithetical, because we know so much violence against Muslim men also is justified under the representation that they're menacing, that they're terroristic, that they're particularly misogynistic and patriarchal, as if Muslim women don't also suffer when the men in our lives are tortured, are kept under security certificates. Sophie Harkat, who is the wife of security certificate detainee Muhammad Harkat, who was first imprisoned without charge in a facility that's known as Canada's Guantanamo North, and then subject to some of the harshest house arrest conditions in Canadian history, all without being actually ever charged criminally, and therefore subject to the kinds of meager protections that are available through the criminal system. Sophie Harkat has talked very powerfully and heartbreakingly about the extremely detrimental effect that these house arrest conditions have had, not only on Muhammad's life, but also on her own, so that she's been forced to act as his jailer, to even monitor him if he goes into a public restroom. And so when we look at gendered Islamophobia, we also have to consider the forms of violence that are meted out directly against Muslim women, but also the way that this demonization of Muslim men in the name of protecting women also produces forms of violence that are detrimental to the life, safety, and health of Muslim women as well.
Yasmine, would you like to follow up on that? On the gendered components?
I love Azeezah and Azeezah's work, and to me, she's already said it all. But I think there is one aspect to me that we also need to consider, which is how everyone is invited in this oppression and victimization of Muslim women, right? So through anti-radicalization discourses, but also tip lines that were created around radicalization, right? We see this creation of this surveillance and violence that everyone can take part in. And so you have women, like you said, Muslim women in particular, who wear religious garb and religious symbols, who are the first victims of this violence. And so they have their hijabs torn out. They are asked not to practice their, or they're forced not to practice their work unless they take off their hijab. So through Bill 21, several teachers and other professionals were forced to leave their jobs if they could not take off their hijab or their veils. And so to me, it's also this discrimination that is state-led, right? It's more than this interpersonal violence that happens in the street. It's also something that is normalized and that everyone is invited to partake in and perpetuate. So I think there is this one aspect, and also the aspect of it becoming what Nasira Ghnif Souleymas, a French sociologist, calls a virtuous racism, right? So she says that Islamophobia in particular constitutes not only a form of racism that thinks of itself as legitimate, but it can also become a virtuous and patriotic racism that is righteous. It's about saving Canada and Canadian values and Canadian ways of life, right, from these barbaric practices and even the visibility even of Islam within public spaces.
Well, a really interesting point. I think it's worth perhaps talking a little bit more, but several of you have mentioned Bill 21 and, of course, the special context of Quebec as a distinct society defined by its francophone Catholic identity, despite the secularism, of the state and society. And I'm wondering, broadly speaking, we're talking about how Canada has a problem with Islamophobia generally, but there's a peculiar or particular way in which Quebec has taken the lead in certain measures that would seem illiberal measures. And so I'm wondering, also because there was a recent judgment on Bill 21 that in some quarters was hailed as rolling back some of its provisions by making exceptions for Anglophone schools and the like. So I'm just interested a little bit more on your take as scholars of this. What do you think about Bill 21? What does it say? And in this context now, it seems that it's coming under some scrutiny, but also great defense. How do you think, will we see politicians actually run electoral risks to confront Bill 21 that they might argue under other circumstances violates charter rights, but are uncomfortable doing so because it's very popular, apparently, in Quebec? So maybe you have some thoughts about that last judgment and about its particular measures.
Do you want me to?
Oh, Azeezah, go ahead.
Yeah. Yasmine, would you like to start? So I think that the case of Bill 21 shows the multiple levels of state action through which this state of exception for Muslims is created and maintained. So we have this law in the first place, which prevents people from working in various public sector jobs from displaying signs of visible religiosity. And let's make no mistake, while this is being represented in some quarters as an equal opportunity, quote unquote, secularism law, we know from the history of this bill and the long history of measures seeking to expel visibly religious Muslim from public space in Quebec, as well as from opinion polls showing that support for this law is really motivated specifically by anti-Muslim animus, not by, for example, antipathy towards Christianity, which historically has been the primary force of supposed religious oppression in the province. When we look at both the history as well as the opinions that are driving support for the bill, it is very clear that this is a law specifically targeting visibly Muslim women. And in the name of rendering it equal, it has expanded its realm of restriction instead of achieving equality by removing the ban altogether. And so first we have the level of provincial action, which has which passed the law, and then also invoked the notwithstanding clause of the Canadian Charter in order to insulate it completely from charter review. And the way that the province has invoked the notwithstanding clause in this case is quite exceptional. It's not just targeting particular provisions of the charter that it has said that it's suspending. Instead, it is a blanket. It is a blanket suspension of all of the provisions of the charter that fall under the possibility of the notwithstanding clause. And as the judge in the Bill 21 case pointed out, this is really a very exceptional use of the notwithstanding clause. It, in effect, yet again creates a legal black hole within which Muslims' basic rights can be indefinitely suspended. And again, as scholars of state-sponsored Islamophobia have pointed out, this isn't a state of exception that's separate from the law, that we can say the law is not responsible for. Instead, it's a state of exception that is created by the racist law and is within the racist architecture of the law. So on the one hand, we have the province which passed the law and has invoked the notwithstanding clause in this exceptional sweeping way. Then we have the Quebec Superior Court, which, as you said, suspended some of the provisions of the law, some marginal provisions of the law relating to English language schools and elective representatives, but left the vast majority of it intact, despite recognizing that the law was dehumanizing towards Muslim women. I mean, it's bad enough if the judge hadn't recognized that this was having negative implications for Muslim women, but in some ways it's even worse if a judge recognizes that it's dehumanizing towards women and yet still refuses to do anything about it, because then what can you do? He's acknowledged the dehumanization, but said there's nothing that can be done about it. So because of the way that the notwithstanding clause was invoked, those challenging the law had to bring ways of challenging it that weren't subject to the notwithstanding clause. So they tried to invoke pre-charter laws. They tried to invoke principles embedded in the architecture of Canadian constitutionalism. They tried to invoke provisions of the charter that weren't subject to the notwithstanding clause. And the judge refused to accept any of these arguments. And so that's the second level at which the exception is sustained, the willingness of the judge to allow it to stand. And then the third level is the refusal of federal politicians to join the challenge against the law. When just asked about it the other day, Justin Trudeau said that no, this law does not, in fact, perpetuate hatred and discrimination. And so actively participating in the severance of state policies like Bill 21 from the type of violence that we saw enacted on the streets of London a few days ago.
Yes, well, one point that you brought up also has been this question about, secularism and how it is understood, and the hypocrisies really around that, where some of the justification has been that, well, this is an extension of the history of the Quiet Revolution that has fought to, secularize and free from the Catholic Church. And so I'm just wondering about the operations of that under the auspices of secularism in Quebec. If you have any thoughts or analysis about how that works, Yasmine.
Well, I think it's really important to note that laïcité, as it is described and talked about today in Quebec law, only came into place in 2004 around the questions of the accommodations, right? And Milo, for example, talks about how the term itself was absent from governmental commissions until the 1990s. And it was really like around the debates on reasonable accommodations and the influence, excuse me, of French politics, that the term itself, so laïcité, first appeared, specifically targeting immigrants, right? So there is this reference to the Quiet Revolution and Quebec's own history, but there is also the influence of this, foreign threat that would be coming into the province and take away its national identity, its language, but also most of all its representation of an idea of secularism that would be an absence, and I'm putting quote here, of religion, even though, for a very long time, and I think it's still there is a cross in the offices of in City Hall. There is, of course, the cross that looks over the whole Montreal in Mont-Royal. And so the Christianity is very much ingrained and part of the society, with all of the holidays that are celebrated, for example, by schools and other national holidays are around Easter, they are around Christmas, etc. So there is this idea of secularism that would be without religion, but I think, Adnan, you have described this as a Christian secularity, and perhaps you can speak more to that. But I think it's really important to think about how secularism and laïcité are constructed and imagined in the public imaginary, and who is rendered invisible, and whose kind of way of life is exalted.
Can I say something? Which is, so in discussing the Quebec law, we've often had this discourse about asking, well, is it racism or is it genuinely secularism? As if the two things are antithetical to each other, as if secularism itself cannot and has not historically been a vehicle for the promulgation of racist and colonial policies. So when we look at the history of laïcité as developed in the French context, for example, we know it was intimately connected to the colonial situation in Algeria, within which these protections for religious groups that were being developed in France were suspended in the case of Algeria, so that colonial powers could exert control over what they saw as dangerous anti-colonial expressions that were being fomented in religious space. When we look at the idea of secularism more broadly, and how both secularism and religion have been constructed, as Yasmine says, not simply in metropoles, but also intimately in relationship to colonial processes as they were unfolding, in relationship to the Christendom, the Christian-centric, Eurocentric representation of Muslims and Jews as quote unquote people with the wrong religion, and indigenous peoples as people with no religion, representations which we see continue to infuse jurisprudence around freedom of religion in Canada, so that while a court upholds the hijab ban in Bill 21, Canadian courts have simultaneously refused to grant protection to indigenous expressions of religion and spirituality, refused to protect sacred lands and waters under the protection of Section 2 religious freedom provisions of the Charter, because it doesn't recognize those as proper expressions of religiosity at all. And so we can't take it for granted that if something is a good faith expression of secularism, that means that it's not also racist and colonial. On the contrary, it perhaps means the exact opposite.
I think that is a really great point that you make there, because that slippage between the phenomenon of race versus religion as the basis for the kind of discrimination or the analytical category matters here, and the fact that there's overlap and slippage between them. But what it points to is the way in which Christian subject position is considered the absolute norm, and variances from it are disabled or excluded in various sorts of ways. So the Muslim is too religious and is incapable of secularity and putting the proper balance of distinguishing between what's properly public in the state and what is privately allowable for personal religious belief and spirituality and so on. And you pointed out the indigenous has no religion and therefore has to be Christianized and missionized, and so we find that. But that the fundamental point here is that who's assimilable and who's not, under what conditions, and that has been a long historic kind of question of the the inability for Muslims to be assimilated. I'm an unassimilable Muslim, and you pointed out in colonial law in Algeria, if you wanted to be really part of the French state, you had to basically give up the, loi musulman. You had to stop being a Muslim in order to have citizenship, and that just seems to have carried over so much. But I guess one other point on this that I was just interested in this Bill 21 and the revised judgment on it is just, there does seem to be a very medieval kind of logic that's been secularized, which is that the public sphere should not have emblems of non-normative people in positions of power and authority. That was what's so interesting about it, is that teachers and public defender, anybody who wields power in society, it seems, has to be not exactly Christian, because they don't put it in those terms, but has to be secular in the Christian secular tradition.
And they demonize Muslims for dimitude.
Right, exactly. I mean, that's what it reminds me of very much, is that kind of, more medieval idea. And, maybe it speaks to, maybe people have some thoughts on this, speaks to the way in which the imagined dominant political community is both predominant demographically, and when that's under threat, there's kind of concerns and problems about that, but also dominant politically. And if that is being changed or replaced by, different groupings with different public presentation inhabiting public roles and positions of authority, it challenges and threatens the idea of that norm being the dominant community in a Canadian multicultural society, so that there is a hierarchical, so that's the point, is that there is a hierarchical logic, and these fears on the extreme end of being replaced. We could be replaced, either demographically or politically displaced. And that seems to be part of the logic that's fueling some of these extremely conservative, reactionary, and violent responses to a changing Canada. Not changing that fast, but even these small changes are producing this kind of violent response. I guess that's not a question. It was just my observations on your discussion. But maybe we should turn to another question. I think, Amel, you have a question.
Yeah, I did have a question about, I guess, the state of exception. I suppose it connects to what you were saying about the hierarchy and Azeezah's comments about the levels of the state levels and the legal system that enable hatred and discrimination in several different ways that you explained. And I was just thinking that we have, a very pertinent example of that state of exception in practice in the terrorism charge that was met out just yesterday against the London attacker. So I was wondering, Azeezah, if you could give us a little bit more background and details about that specific charge and what it means about and how it relates to that state of exception you talked about.
Well, you're very right, Amel, that counterterrorism law has been one of the primary sites for the creation of states of exception through Canadian law, and racialized states of exception specifically applied against Muslims, so that 98% of completed terrorism prosecutions in Canada have been against Muslims, even though they've been responsible for less than 10% of deaths from public political violence in Canada since 9/11. So we have this very gross disparity in the way these counterterrorism laws are being applied. So in one sense, I understood why people were so eager for Nathaniel Veltman to be charged with terrorism for these murders in this case. But unfortunately, this particular charge does very little to address the racism inherent to Canadian counterterrorism practice so far. And this is because while Muslims have primarily been criminalized for acts of violence that have not been committed, they've been criminalized preemptively, preventively, on the basis of risk. Nathaniel Veltman, in contrast, is being criminalized for an act of violence that he has already committed. And so it's not really a departure from the normal functionings of criminal law. So when we look at the particular provision that he's been charged under, the main charge is the section of the criminal code which holds that murder is automatically first-degree murder if it's committed in the context of an act of terrorism, even without premeditation. But in this case, Veltman was charged with first-degree murder anyway. There was evidence of premeditation, so it probably won't have much of an effect on his sentencing. And coming from an abolitionist perspective, I think we should be wary of this idea that long sentences are actually the solution to racism when they're premised on a carceral system that is inherently racist in its formulation. And the counterterrorism laws are one of the primary exceptions, or one of the primary examples of that. So let's look at how Muslims have actually been treated in Canadian counterterrorism prosecutions. They've been criminalized for acts very distant from violence, often with very extensive involvement by state informants in formulating the plots, raising various serious concerns of entrapment, particularly against Muslims who have been struggling with mental health issues. The criminal provisions are very vaguely defined and they're largely overlapping, meaning that for the same one underlying act, Muslims have been convicted of multiple charges, even just for one act. There's normally a principle in criminal law that prevents people being convicted on multiple charges for the same act, but this principle appears to have been suspended in the context of counterterrorism prosecutions. And so then the upshot is that we have Muslims effectively being double punished on a preventive basis, receiving very high sentences, even when no actual injury has been caused. So let's look at the case of someone like Rahab Dagmush, who is a Syrian woman diagnosed with schizophrenia, waved a golf club and a knife around in a Canadian Tire, caused no serious injuries, was punished with 7 years imprisonment, which is just 1 year less than Braden Bushby received for killing Indigenous woman Barbara Kentner, a juxtaposition which speaks to the devaluation of both Muslim and Indigenous life. Moreover, this concept of terrorism, as Yasmine has said, extends far beyond just the criminal realm. It extends to all sorts of state actions that ensnare Muslims in the net of pre-criminalization, whether through counter-radicalization programs or CSIS interrogations or things like no-fly lists. How many years did it take the government to even provide the possibility of a basic redress mechanism for Muslim kids who are on the no-fly list, clearly by accident, just because of the accident of having a similar name to someone on the list, which itself is an expression of racism, that people are being targeted for having the types of names that Muslims have. Nathaniel Veltman is not being subject to any of this. I would not want him and white communities to be subject to any of this. As a Muslim, I don't want anyone to have been treated the way that Muslims have been treated in the name of the war on terror. And so to the extent that this terrorism charge makes us think that we now have a post-racial counterterrorism regime, I think it's actually dangerous because it hasn't actually addressed any of this racialized pre-criminal risk-based persecution of Muslims through the legal system at all. That firmly remains in place.
Absolutely. Something that I have been thinking about a lot in my own work has been precisely what you have exposed here, Azeezah, in terms of how can we think about anti-terrorism legislation and having these white supremacists being prosecuted for their crimes, but at the same time thinking about abolition and the abolition of the injustice system, and how people are being, and people of color in particular, Indigenous people and Black and Brown folks are being over-criminalized by the justice system. And so having that on the one side, and also knowing, like you said, that anti anti-terrorism legislation is primarily used against Muslim populations. You were talking earlier about how 56 of the people, I think, as of 2016, 56 people of the people that were prosecuted under anti-terrorism legislation, only one was non-Muslim, right? So we know that these laws are even created against us, against our communities, and how we do not want other communities to experience this violence, this institutional and governmental violence. At the same time, I think, like we really need to think about justice and collective justice and what that means, and acknowledging this violence and what it means. And also thinking about how a lot of the anti-radicalization organizations and action plans, etc., have, were built around this Muslim figure, but little by little, and I'm noticing it in my own work, they are moving towards addressing white supremacist violence and racist violence. But at the same time, of course, the way that it is presented is very different. So when we talk about Muslim communities, it's about the generalization of, all of these stereotypes of Muslim barbarity and violence and extremism, and the fact that we're all homophobic, and that, we do not believe in gender equality, etc. But at the same time, when they present white supremacist violence, it is something that is always of the quote unquote lone wolf. It's something that is singular to a person. It's about their mental state and mental health status, rather than something that is systemic. And like Adnan, you were saying earlier, like living in this racist space and racist nation. So I think my question is to all of you, because I have myself been struggling with this idea, and Azeezah, you've definitely started to answer this question. What do we do? How can we think about white supremacy and white supremacist violence, and it being charged as anti-terrorism or under anti-terrorism legislation, but at the same time thinking at it through an abolitionist lens?
That is the fundamental question. And I think we have to begin with the concept of terrorism itself. We know that when the term terrorism was originally coined during the French Revolution, it was to refer to the violence of the state itself. Yet, with this history of colonial states co-opting and using this concept of terrorism in order to delegitimize anti-colonial resistance, it has now become almost exclusively limited to the violence of non-state actors. And it's also become highly moralized, so that Lisa Stempnitsky in her book Disciplining Terror points out that while terrorism was originally understood as a neutral tactic that parties on all sides of a conflict may use, it has now become defined in large part through the interventions of Israel with the aim of demonizing the Palestinian people. Terrorism has now almost exclusively become defined as an inherently illegitimate form of violence that is wielded exclusively by morally evil actors. And so it becomes impossible then in that framing to think of the United States or Canada as terrorist states, at least from their own perspective. And I think that concept of state terrorism is really what we need to recover. When we see the bodies of Indigenous children buried in mass graves outside of genocidal residential schools, that is an example of state terror. When we see police killing Black, Indigenous, Muslim people with absolutely no consequence from the state, that is an example of state terror. Yasmine talked earlier about how jarring it was to see police forces responsible for racist violence now saying that they stand in solidarity with Muslims. We know the Peel police, for example, put out a statement boasting about how they were marching in the anti-hate march just weeks after they were exonerated for killing in cold blood Muslim man Ijaz Chaudhry in his own home as he was struggling with mental distress, and yet they were found to have no responsibility or culpability in the case. When we look at the case of someone like Soleiman Fakiri, a Muslim man, a refugee from Afghanistan, who was beaten to death by guards in an Ontario jail cell as he was in the throes of an episode of schizophrenia. And consistently, the state has said that there will be no accountability for the guards that were involved, because there were so many guards who were involved in the beating that it is impossible to know who struck the fatal blow in that case. That is an example of state terrorism. And so while our discourse of terrorism has become almost entirely isolated to these individual actors, and Nathaniel Veltman in a van, one person who we can look at and identify and charge, what's much more difficult is to see how these operations of violence that are institutionalized by the state, and it is precisely because they are so big and powerful and complex and involve so many actors and levels of action, that responsibility becomes very difficult to pin down. In fact, this is an exercise of what legal scholar Scott Beach calls irresponsibilization. It's legal irresponsibility. It's the legal construction of irresponsibility in order to prevent accountability for the precisely those forms of violence that are the largest scale and most pervasive, and therefore become those that are ironically subject to the least accountability. That's what we need to bring back to the conversation. And so if we're talking about terrorism as inherently illegitimate violence, we have to remember that Canada's supposed monopoly on the use of legitimate violence has been premised on the genocidal erasure of Indigenous orders of governance and Indigenous sovereignty. And so if we're talking about illegitimate violence, surely the legitimacy of the Canadian state's sovereign power to use violence also has to be brought into question.
I think that also really connects to something I've been thinking about. Someone mentioned earlier, state surveillance like CSIS, and I was just thinking that, we have examples of heinous violence that you pointed out, but I think there's also another level of, the war on terror legitimizing state surveillance in a way that, to me, also seems like a form of state terrorism, to surveil people, to CSIS has been known to harass students of, depending on whether you're Muslim or whether you're a leftist activist or whatever it is. And it just seems to me of another connection to our colonial history and the colonial tendency to sort of make the state presence known, make the police state presence known in different communities by constantly surveilling or harassing them, even before the level of actually meting out violence against them. So I think that's another connection that people don't necessarily make often here in Canada, that things like CSIS and surveillance and, constantly being questioned is in a way a form of as terrorizing people who the state sees as threats.
Yasmine, did you want to say something about that? But I should say 100%. Amel, 100%. And, in the wake of the US Patriot Act, we saw some academics, for example, saying things like this reverses the democratic bargain, that while it's supposed to be the state that is transparent and private citizens that have privacy, measures like the Patriot Act and other surveillance measures reverse that democratic bargain, so that it's the state which is hidden behind walls of secrecy, whereas it's private citizens that are made to be transparent. But of course, we know that this democratic bargain has never actually pertained to those populations who have been colonized and racialized by these quote unquote democratic states. And the very problem with these operations of violence, like a CSIS surveillance, for example, is that while the quote unquote terrorism of Muslims and the violence and the devastation of that are made to be very visible to us, it's splashed across the front pages of our newspaper, these far more pervasive operations of violence by agencies like CSIS are largely hidden behind walls of secrecy and unaccountability. And so it gives people a profoundly skewed and distorted view of what the primary sources of violence are in our society, what are the primary sources of threat. And this leads to absurd outcomes, like how in the wake of the killing of 2 people back in 2014 by Muslim quote unquote extremists, vast majorities of Canadians supported the expansion of draconian counterterrorism regimes, whereas in the wake of the Quebec mosque shooting, which killed 3 times more people, a majority of Canadians were still against even just a non-binding motion in Parliament, M103, to discuss and denounce systemic Islamophobia. And it's because we have a fundamentally skewed perception of what are the primary sources of violence in our society and who is primarily victimized by them, precisely because the most pervasive and dangerous operations of violence are hidden behind secrecy. I mean, as a law student, I worked on some of these cases of men who were tortured with the complicity of the Canadian government. They had to fight for so many years to receive any kind of acknowledgement, any kind of compensation, in large part because so much of the evidence was rendered secret purely for the protection of these state officials, who even now none of them have been prosecuted as required under international law, and on the contrary, many of them were actually promoted and received awards. And so, as you say, it is exactly what is made invisible to us that is exactly where we most need to be looking.
I think that's very well said, and what it points out, I think, is why combating and rooting out the problem of Islamophobia is going to be very difficult, because it's clearly embedded, as this discussion has really demonstrated, in society and in certain social attitudes that of a racialized kind of identity, when we're talking about white supremacy and so forth, but also deeply in the colonial settler state on behalf of that particular community. And that's the usefulness, it seems, of Islamophobia, is that it's very useful in reversing that relationship between state and citizen that you were just talking about, Azeezah, and that, historically it may never have, been in the appropriate balance, but nonetheless, the cultural dimensions and this sort of atmosphere and culture of fear and paranoia that can be established through Islamophobia and the idea of the Muslim as some foreign threat, either as a security threat but also as a cultural threat, and the two can kind of interpenetrate, allows the state to overcome a lot of opposition that would be there in civil society, the kinds of resistance to expand, these powers of surveillance and, security control. And so I think that's a huge challenge as a result. And so I guess as sort of final concluding thoughts in wrapping up our conversation, we notice that a lot of Muslim communities across Canada, their allies, people who are outraged by this terrible act of violence that took place in London, Ontario, are rising up in various ways to try and become politically active, to raise the question of Islamophobia and what to do about it. I guess my question to you is, what advice would you give about where efforts should be directed? What would be most effective? We understand it's a really huge challenge, but to give people some hope and some meaningful political orientation, what do you recommend as the best ways that we can confront, given the analysis that you've presented? What would you recommend?
So first of all, I think it's extremely important that we focus our gaze not only on the private, quote unquote, extremists like Nathaniel Veltman, but focus our gaze on the state itself, including those agencies such as CSIS and RCMP and police, which are now representing themselves as the solution to the problem of Islamophobia, rather than themselves being the very source of systemic structural state-sponsored Islamophobia. I think it is vital that we not only support the victims of hate crimes, including this young boy Fayaz, who has been orphaned and traumatized, but we also have to support those who are confronting the sharpest edges of state Islamophobic violence. Mohammed Harkat, security certificate detainee, is facing ongoing attempts by the Canadian state to deport him to serious risk of torture in Algeria in violation of international law. And the cruelty of his case is spoken to in the fact that the judge even denied him legal funding for the lawyer, Barb Jackman, who is an expert in contesting security certificates and is one of the few people who is intimately familiar with the Kafkaesque architecture of these certificates and therefore can adequately challenge them. And so he is confronting some of the harshest edges of state violence, a very powerfully resourced state with himself being seriously under-resourced. And so we need to support people like him. We need to support people like Abu Sufyan Abdulrazik, against whom the government has spent $2 million a year trying to fight his claims for compensation for torture. We need to support those victims of state Islamophobia. And thirdly, we also need to be in absolute unwavering solidarity with Indigenous nations of this land who are working to reclaim their sovereignty from the Canadian government that has stolen it from them.
Thank you, Azeezah. And I, you know, in that, I think that all of these violence and violent acts are not happening in silos, and they're all interconnected, whether we think about anti-Indigenous violence or anti-Black and anti-Asian violence that has been happening in the last few years, more, you know, outspokenly in the media, but that have always been present. I think that it's really important for us to show up for our communities and to be there. And I was listening to another podcast called Code Switch, in which Hakeem Jefferson was talking about how oftentimes people show up in episodic ways, right? So there is a violent act that happens and everyone goes to the vigil, and then we go back to our everydays, and we forget about what happens, and then something else happens and we forget again. And to me, we really have to stay connected, and we really need to focus about the greater systems that are at play here, and think about all of these acts that you said, all of these solidarities that we can show up for, Azeezah, but also the continued efforts of various groups that are doing this kind of work, and to make sure that it doesn't get lost, and that, you know, we don't show up in only episodic ways, but in continued support.
Well, I want to really thank you both, all three of you, for an absolutely wonderful, enriched conversation about this really serious problem of Islamophobia in Canada and beyond. We didn't have a chance to talk too much about intersections with the global Islamophobia industry and its circulation in contexts beyond Canada's borders, because there's so much to talk about here just in Canada. I hope we'll have you back on at some time in the future to extend the analysis to those other contexts. And I thank you so much for joining me today, Dr. Yasmine Djerbal, recent PhD graduate from Cultural Studies program at Queen's University. Where can people connect with you or follow your work if they're interested?
You can follow me on Twitter at yes_meme.
Wonderful. I will follow. If I'm not already following, I will right away. And also thank you so much to Azeezah Kanji, legal academic based in Toronto and a writer. Where can people find your work and follow you?
Thank you, Adnan and Amel. And I mostly write for Al Jazeera these days, but also I've done a couple of recent pieces for the Yellowhead Institute, which is an Indigenous-led critical policy think tank at X University, formerly called Ryerson University. And I really encourage you to check out the work of the Yellowhead Institute for those who are looking for ways to be in solidarity with Indigenous nations in redressing this original sin of white supremacy that lies at the heart of the Canadian state and gives rise to these ongoing acts of violence.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And also thanks so much, Amel Bensalim, for joining me as a co-host and discussant and participant in today's discussion. Where can people follow you?
Yeah, thanks. If you want to follow the work that I've been doing with MSGP, you just follow the Majlis podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and anywhere else. I work on them all the time, even if I'm not hosting. For my more personal academic work, I do have a Twitter at ye old Amel, which exposes my medieval bias, I suppose. But other than that, please follow up with MSGP and the work that we do here at the Majlis. Thanks.
Thank you very much, listeners, for joining us. We look forward to having you. If you are not subscribing, please subscribe. We've got episodes coming up that I think you'll be interested in. We just finished our previous episode on the life of Edward Said with the author of a new biography, Timothy Brennan. It's called Places of Mind, A Life of Edward Said, and we had a wonderful conversation. We'll have more like that and about contemporary issues in the future, so stay tuned. And for now, ma salam.